Capcom has unveiled Dead Rising Deluxe Remastered. DRDR, huh? I thought we already had a DRDR. It seems as though this remaster of sorts is a means of Capcom revisiting the original Dead Rising game via the RE engine. I had an initial reaction to the quick teaser from last month, but held my tongue, well, publicly, and waited for more information. And more they provided. So let's go over that, as well as my thoughts. But first, a little background. Dead Rising as a franchise was really drawn to a corner. While the first two games saw great success, as well as acclaim from both critics and fans, the later entries and other notable projects relating to the series were met with either mixed reception or outright vitriol. All the while, the likes of Frank West and yeah, just Frank West, made guest appearances in other games and such, raising fan adoration despite being a limited protagonist, only really striving in the original game he was from. What I'm trying to say is, it's hard to get on the Dead Rising train without Frank West, which likely explains the desperate inclusion as returning protagonist in Dead Rising 4, an installment you've probably heard me talk about enough. Reflecting on the feedback on Dead Rising 4, the last game in the series before this new project, a lot of people just kept saying Capcom should retcon the events of the game with a new installment or similar nonsense, but like, the plot was already a mess before that game and everything already felt drawn out at that point. I think the only realistic move, if any, was rebooting the series in order to start fresh. Still, no news for years. Capcom would instead support other IPs and actually regain a ton of support from fans since the near end of the 8th generation. There's of course the various Resident Evil projects which usually found their success in audiences. Devil May Cry 5 was lauded as a fantastic return to form for the series, 6 years after the failed reboot. Dragon's Dogma 2 was a long-awaited sequel that also satisfied fans. Even Phoenix Wright would find notoriety again, receiving impressive remasters which include newly translated games that were originally never released outside of Japan. Of course, Capcom hasn't had a perfect track record these past 7 years, but I can't help but notice how much it felt like Dead Rising 4 back in 2016 was literally the last wholly bad move they made. With that in mind, it felt right that they'd take a nice long break from the series. It's not like Dead Rising was ever super successful, but at the same time, getting our attention with a new project felt inevitable, especially with the resurgence of Resident Evil as a franchise over these past few years. Zombies, and more zombos, right? So, out of basically nowhere, Capcom drops a teaser for Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster, and in the middle of a regular workday, my phone's blowing up with friends and followers notifying me. My heart sank, my mind started going all over the place just seeing that come up.
Frank West. Remember that name, because the whole world's gonna know it in 3 days.
When I finally saw the new teaser myself, we saw some familiar visuals, now coded in shiny new graphics, some swanky music, and a stunningly new Frank West. And all that crossed my mind was, that definitely isn't TJ Rotolo. And with that, I sat there pondering about the now real idea that Dead Rising 1 is being remade. Shortly after this, Capcom would provide new information while also interviewing the developers of the remake, which I presume includes Yoshinori Kawano, the director of the original game, as he's one of the few talking heads. While it isn't stated how he's part of this new Deluxe Remaster project, I'm glad to see he's still a part of Capcom. His latest gig before this being the director of the Separate Ways DLC campaign for the RE4 remake. Speaking of remakes, why are they being weird about that? What kind of subtitle is Deluxe Remaster? That was actually a cute angle the presentation took when discussing this.
You may be thinking, that looks like a full-on remake. We had the same thought, so we spoke with 3 key staff to get to the bottom of this Deluxe Remaster.
From what I understand, they're not using the term remake because they're keeping as much of the original game design intact with little meddling or changes. It's literally Dead Rising 1, according to their calculations, but with a complete graphic overhaul. Capcom doesn't refer to RE2 or RE3's remakes as remasters because the raw gameplay and design are completely different. I guess this means Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster is more in line with projects like the Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy or Shadow of the Colossus on PS4. And as I just discussed in my previous video describing my gripes with remakes, It's hard for me to really appreciate projects like this, mainly because the sole reason behind these kinds of projects is financial gain, while usually providing a new art style that isn't nearly as charming or unique as the original game. The original was already loved for both gameplay and visual style. Why would you replace either? Well, I know it's because of the dreaded race for high-end graphics. And if anyone knows me, they know I already consider Dead Rising 1 to be a perfect game. So my headstrong attitude has only hardened seeing literally any sort of change. But I won't mince words. I'm happy that at the very least, this project is being handled in-house. As someone that adores the original Dead Rising, I can't help but posit that outside hires are a huge factor of that series going astray after the very first game. Blue Castle literally had no choice but to build the sequels differently. The MT Framework engine wasn't bilingual. With that said, the prosperity of the RE engine was interesting. Much like MT Framework, this is Capcom's Swiss Army knife of a game engine. However, there was something about MT Framework games where they almost always had this consistency with its vibrancy and colors. Unless the art direction of the game was desaturated or muted, the games were always colorful with vibrant visuals. And that was part of Dead Rising's appeal. The zombie-infested venue was a bright and colorful shopping mall. This added to the juxtaposition between the story all the characters took seriously, and how goofy and fun the actual gameplay can be, as well as your own influence upon the cutscenes via wardrobe. Regarding what we've been shown so far, there's plenty of instances that are pretty nice looking.
Take a look out there!
Hahaha, wow, beautiful, wow.
But other parts of this just don't look as appealing to me now. I think it has to do with the chase for realism. Dead Rising 1 always felt like this perfect balance between realism and artistry, but now I think it's leaning a little too much towards one direction. And a lot of things are looking dusty and washed out, a common problem I have with a lot of AAA games, frankly. Still, I can only judge from what they've shown so far, and I have to stress this, a lot of it looks really good. The attention to detail is impressive, and some characters look pretty close to how they did back in 2006, with just a few tweaks that don't really bother me. Except Brad's face. What's going on there? He looks like a face swap app. But while we're talking about the visual appeal of Dead Rising, I recall a lot of people were taken aback when I said in my old retrospective that nearly everyone in the original game was ugly. What I've always meant by that, and perhaps it could have been more clear, is that everyone looked real. Because most real people are ugly. The common man looks like a schlub, and that's why I've always loved Frank and his potato face, among other reasons. With that said, Frank still looks ugly, but I don't know, his new face looks really off to me. I think it has to do with how big and expressive his eyes are now. In the original game, he looks pretty close to a real dude, especially for 2006's standards. Now he's looking a little too cartoonish. But let's be real, Frank's face never stays the same. It's always changing, and I have no idea why. I think the closest anyone got to his Dead Rising 1 face was Project Cross Zone, and that was hecking 2D art and animation. A certain part of the presentation did peeve me off just a bit though.
For example, Resident Evil, Capcom's other zombie franchise, focused on quality over quantity. Dead Rising took a different approach. The goal was to pack as many zombies as possible into that huge shopping mall. This meant each individual zombie wasn't as polished as we would have liked.
Excuse me? Sir, hold on. Sir, excuse me? No. Are you insinuating they didn't provide quality zombie models? No way. These zombies looked fucking amazing in 2006. What are you talking about? Perhaps it was due to Resident Evil not getting a 7th gen game until about 3 years later, but even then, I'm willing to argue the infected fodder did not look as good as the Dead Rising zombies. These were literally the best looking zombies in any video game at the time. And I'll tell you why they gave the zombies so much attention to detail and how they were both quality and quantity. In the original Dead Rising, using Frank's camera was never mandatory, but it was certainly encouraged as it helped you level up and such. This meant players could switch to a first-person view at pretty much any time, as well as being able to zoom in right on their faces whenever they wanted. So they had to look good, and look good they did. I don't know, maybe my jimmies are getting a little too rustled over this, but come on, man. If anything, I would have bragged about how zombie variety can be even higher now, since seeing doubles in the original game was pretty common. Speaking a bit more on the zombies, I'm happy to see that not only have they clearly upped the variety in their attire and features, the classics I've known and loved all these years are also back looking better than ever. So that's cool. All of the actors seem to have been replaced, which is a bit of a drag. A lot of people have already expressed disappointment over the lack of TJ Rotolo for Frank, and I'm bummed about that too. Rotolo being replaced for Dead Rising 4 was already such a big controversy back in 2016, so much so that it was a wonderful surprise that he reprised the role in Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite only a year later. Even with weaker writing, his voice adds such an undeniable charm to the character.
This is great! Frank West, Pulitzer Prize-winning photojournalist. I like the sound of that.
If any animated character is their voice, it's Frank West. The lack of Rotolo isn't a deal breaker for me though. However, it seems everyone was replaced, and there does not appear to be any sort of way to opt in for the old voice actors. I'm sure folks have suggested that Capcom should have just reused the old takes, kind of like what Konami is doing for the upcoming remake to Metal Gear Solid 3. I could be totally wrong, but I theorize it's because they're going to punch up the story in certain ways besides adding new in-game banter. Perhaps add some things that'll connect it with an eventual Dead Rising 2 remake? I could be completely off the mark though. It's just, for a remaster, getting an entirely new cast to reperform all the lines seems excessive. I doubt it's a rights issue. If anything, I just feel bad for some of these new actors having to follow up the original voices, which were literally all perfect in my opinion.
I want you to stop the line, Gramps. If the line stops, then the zombies come back. And that won't be any fun at all.
Come on, you think you can top the Crypt Keeper? Or how about Adam Clark as Steven?
Listen to me. And listen good, partner. I don't allow vandalism in my store!
There is no way in hell this can be recaptured with someone else. No way, no how. We haven't talked about the gameplay though, have we? Well, it's hard to talk about since I can only observe what I can from the footage we've been shown. But I have to say, it's pretty impressive so far. While I would gladly take 0 quality of life changes, the ones they've shown so far aren't damning. The UI has more information on screen without being more intrusive, but I'm not a big fan of those captions on the right. Perhaps they can be turned off? Autosave is whatever, I'm gonna turn it off if that's even an option, but a lot of the tiny little knacks from the original game are still there, like the physics. I was scared that they would resort to ragdoll physics for the zombie deaths, losing their snappy falling animation, but no, their quick falls are still intact, and a lot of the items and attacks seem to work the same way as they did in 2006. One thing I couldn't help but notice, there's no impact stops anymore. I call them that because I can't think of a better term. Just see how the game stops for literally 1 or 2 frames with every impact. Impact stop, an intentional design choice, and adds a little oomph to the attacks. This seems to have been completely removed, which is a bit of a bummer. Still, moving around, fighting, and shooting looks as stiff, awkward, and perfect as it was back in 2006. And I'm really happy to see that. The developers are insistent that they're trying as hard as they can to keep everything intact regarding the game design, as they want to respect the original design, and maybe even purists such as myself. And I salute their valiant efforts.
We could have made them more realistic with today's tools, but we wanted to preserve the unique and comical movements that made the original Dead Rising so special.
Moving Dead Rising 1 into a brand new engine and getting the little details down must have been insanely tough. They certainly didn't eyeball things and go good enough like certain other remakes. The developers seem to deeply respect what the original game represented. Unlike every other marketing bit that gets flung at us when a remake or sequel of X is being handled by Y, they're not treating the original game like some sort of horribly flawed, junky piece that needed fixing. I'm actually so sick of seeing that, especially from developers that had nothing to do with the original game. Instead of talking down on all previous efforts and acting like every move back then was a mistake, the developers are praising how timeless the original Dead Rising feels and how they want to maintain that. Perhaps not just for this one iteration, but maybe for future entries as well? Huh? So, some last thoughts. It's fine. Mulling over everything and seeing how much they're trying to maintain the spirit of the original, I'm trying my hardest to drown out the voice in my head asking, but why should I play this over the original game then? And doing my best to be interested in this new project. And like I said, it's really awesome that the people involved are showing a deep respect for the original Dead Rising. So, it's fine. I'm not overjoyed about Deluxe Remastered, but I'm not angry either. As a remake, it's inoffensive. But how necessary is it, especially with how readily available the original game is on new consoles and PC? Just give me a Switch port, I would shamelessly buy that. But for those still watching, please consider the huge bias that I have. I've been looking at Dead Rising as this perfect game since I was a teenager. Nothing is ever changing that. I love it so much that I can't really jump on board to see literally anything different in a remake project. Or remaster project. Whatever, guys. But I don't want to spoil the fun either. It's an interesting time to be a Dead Rising fan. More than ever before, I think. All I'm thinking about now is what this means for future entries. I think our zombie-packed world is truly rising from the dead. Obviously, if it were up to me, this franchise would just remain dormant, but that is not how a business works. Capcom not only looks at sales numbers and such, they stay in touch with communities, they research, they provide surveys for everyone with an internet connection to partake in, and if they see a large amount of interest in something like Dead Rising, they're not going to ignore that. This is also sort of the only option they really had if they wanted to capitalize on Frank West while simultaneously erasing the character assassination he suffered in Dead Rising 4. It also kind of speaks for what little impact the rest of the protagonists made. Nobody seems to really care for Chuck or Nick, they just love Frank. And hey, Kawano's probably happy to see so many people get excited to revisit the original Willamette incident. How can I complain about that? I imagine this remake is going to be a new jumping off point, as the story itself was so exhausted and muddied by the end of Dead Rising 4. This Deluxe Remaster seems to be bringing the series back to the basics. I'm kinda surprised that there's no online co-op nor combo weapons, but again, that obviously speaks for how much the developers involved respect the original game as an experience. All we can do now is hope for the best. The game is already very close to release. In some ways, I'm still looking forward to this new interpretation and what it means for Dead Rising in the future. And what is there left to ask? Oh, is Larry the Butcher white now?